Greg is a partner at the Nichols Group. He previously served as Associate Director of Health Programs at the White House Office of Management and Budget, where he oversaw the annual healthcare budget for the Department of Health and Human Services. Don Dempsey is the Managing Director of the Marwood Group's Washington, D.C. office. He's a former Associate Director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, where he managed OMB's budgetary oversight of the Departments of Health and Human Services, Education, Labor, certain components of the Department of Agriculture, the Social Security Administration, as well as a multitude of smaller agencies. Joe Grogan. Joe is a visiting senior fellow from the University of Southern California Schaefer Center and the former director of the United States Domestic Policy Council, an assistant to the president, and was a senior healthcare official in the Office of Management and Budget from 2017 to 2019. He was appointed a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force in January 2020. If you have a question that you'd like to ask one of our panelists, please put it in the chat and I'll try to work it into the program. But for now, to start this off, I'd like each of you to share a bit more information about your experiences at OMB and one thing you found interesting about the president's budget request. Joe, let's start with you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me on with Don Dempsey and Greg D'Angelo, who it's always a pleasure for me to talk to them because I always learn something from them. Don had come before me in the Bush administration as OMB Health PAD, and D'Angelo came after me as PAD when I became domestic policy advisor. I think top line for me on the budget is, while there are interesting nuggets in there, which we're going to discuss, it's very lacking in ambition. Gone is a lot of the sweeping goals of last year and references to the Build Back Better proposal. That isn't in here at all. The other thing that's really missing is a lot of discussion of drug pricing. Of course, that was a big applause line at the State of the Union, but there's not much there. You don't see a lot of discussion of the Affordable Care Act. There's an offhand reference to the extension of the subsidies. But in healthcare, it's not a particularly ambitious set of proposals. But I think it's important, and I think Greg and Don can talk about this as well, when you look at the budget and understand its function, it's a disciplinary mechanism, at least that's its purpose, to discipline the various departments and agencies to not come up with new policies and proposals throughout the year that haven't been vetted by the Office of Management and Budget and the White House. And that's really its purpose. The budget's got other purposes as well, but it's a key purpose here. So I think looking at it, and you talk about some of the regulations that are referenced, you talk about some of these proposals, I wonder, looking ahead with Congress so well split, how aggressive they're going to be in pursuing any broad healthcare agenda over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks, Joe. And Greg, what's one thing you found interesting about the president's budget request?
I have to agree with Joe. I thought the lack of detail around Build Back Better was probably the big story coming out of the budget. There was a New York Times article that came out shortly after its release that said missing from Biden's budget is signature policy agenda, and talked about how it was relegated to footnotes, and that's not very common. The piece goes on to discuss some of the history. I mean, those sorts of things, placeholders or deficit neutral reserve funds are used generally when the administration hasn't set a policy yet. So it's during a transition year, not usually at this point in administration. So I thought that was very fascinating, as well as something else that jumped out at me was I felt like there wasn't a clear vision or discussion of what happens at the end of the public health emergency. So, for example, what is the administration's policy with regard to extending Medicare telehealth flexibilities? These are really just brief mentions in the budget. There was a section that talked about ongoing priorities and more to come later. I just found those to be two big omissions, as well as the lack of inclusion of things like the COVID supplemental request that they made. In addition to kind of, we can talk more about this later. There was a huge new proposal around new mandatory spending for pandemic preparedness. It wasn't clear to me sort of, how that relates to the other proposed increases in the discretionary side of the budget for similar or related activities. But net, I think the Times article kind of had it right when it talked about the irony is that some of the things that were detailed in the budget are the things that are unlikely to actually occur, whereas the things that could occur were not at all really mentioned in any degree of specificity. So happy to elaborate on those points and turn it over to you, Don, to share your initial insights.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Greg. And I think the thing that struck me about the budget is what's not in there, not just around potential reconciliation legislation or Build Back Better, but no discussion or mention of trying to extend the life of the Medicare Part A trust fund. The last, not just the last trustees report, but the previous 3 or 4 trustees reports have shown the trust fund going broke here very soon in like 2026. Interestingly enough, Congress has never let it get closer than 4 years without taking some type of action. And typically, the president is obviously part of that process. And if nothing occurs and the date doesn't change, we'll have sort of broken that tradition, and next year it will be within 3 years. So interesting that, no proposals, nothing to extend the life of the trust fund. And the trustees report's supposed to be out this week, and I don't think anyone expects it to actually be out this week. It'll probably be delayed, who knows how many months, but it's setting up for some interesting times in the next couple of years.
Great, thanks, Don. And let's stick with you and back it up a bit. Why is the budget important? In other words, why does it matter?
Well, I think it plays a number of different roles. One, it sets the administration's priorities, details what they would like to get done this year. Potentially there may be policy proposals that maybe they won't be accomplished this year, but they may be accomplished in the near future, or maybe even the longer term future. It's the opening, sort of action of setting the stage of doing the appropriations and potential changes to mandatory spending in the annual budget cycle that Congress will, craft their budget resolution at some point here. Hopefully, they seem to not do that as much as they used to with a regular basis. And the budget also contains very technical language for the appropriators as we begin the budget cycle. Eventually, regardless of what happens with the budget resolution, the appropriators will have to write appropriations legislation. And there's a lot of technical language in the budget resolution that helps the appropriators when they write the appropriations language for the next fiscal year. There's also often, there may be, not always, but often mandatory proposals that generate savings, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion here or whatever. And, typically at the end of the year, if Congress has to do legislation where they're extending some type of mandatory program or sometimes creating a new one, these proposals can be used as offsets, maybe not necessarily how the administration intended them, but it is often a source of where Congress is looking for ideas to do mandatory savings. Are there any in the budget? And, finally, OMB and the budget, it includes historical spending data that they are our official scorekeepers. The budget tells us how much money we actually spent, which is important where you think about, if you want to analyze what's happened in the past, where it might guide us in the future. The budget, includes that actual spending data that's necessary for that type of analysis, and it's the official numbers.
Thanks, Don. And here's another question for each of you. Let's start with Greg this time. What's in this budget? And maybe more importantly, what's not in it?
Thanks, Jim. Let me start with what's in it and cover, the discretionary side a little bit, and then mandatory. I could lay out some of the big things that jumped out at me. There are very large proposed increases in discretionary spending. In total for HHS, $127 billion is requested for discretionary spending in fiscal year 2023. That's a $27 billion increase over the prior enacted level. A large increase for CDC, 9.9 billion, an increase of 2.8 billion for them. NIH, $49 billion request, including a $5 billion increase, which is largely for ARPA-H and the Cancer Moonshot. Although, I do find it somewhat interesting that the Cancer Moonshot is a big initiative of the president's, but a particular dollar amount was not specified. It's really just assumed as part of this ARPA-H request, should those dollars be made available. And there's also a large increase for the FDA, a total budget request of 8.4 billion, which is a 2.8 billion increase. So, large increases on the discretionary side. There are other modest increases for like the SNS and BARDA, some of the core public health and preparedness funding. I think the interesting thing about the discretionary request is that not only are these like large increases, but I think it's unlikely this year to see the appropriators kind of agree to spending at those levels. In particular, I think you're likely to see a continuing resolution at the end of this fiscal year, given that it's an election year and many observers believe the House will flip control. So, the discretionary request is sort of overly generous and probably largely dead on arrival, while there may be some components that I think could have legs in some form or fashion. On the mandatory side, the budget requests 1.5 trillion in mandatory outlays for fiscal year 2023. I sort of think of healthcare in two buckets: health, which is Medicaid, CHIP coverage, under 65 population, and then Medicare, which is kind of the other big bucket. In the health portfolio, as I mentioned before, there's new mandatory spending proposed for future pandemics. In total, almost 82 billion over 5 years for ASPR, CDC, NIH, and FDA. And this is what I was getting at earlier in my comments. It's not really clear kind of what the principle is behind making these funds mandatory and how these funds relate to and are different from some of the core base resources that are requested on the discretionary side. Another health proposal that is on the mandatory side that I think could garner some attention is they're proposing a new HIV national program to provide PrEP at no cost to the uninsured for approximately $10 billion. There's a series of mental health proposals that I know Joe wants to speak about a little bit in more detail, so I won't get into those too much. Those were about 50 billion over 10 years, I believe, in cost. There's a new proposal for providing vaccines to uninsured adults at a cost of roughly 25 billion. And that's sort of the health side, some of the proposals that were big initiatives. And most notably, they're all new spending proposals. As we discussed earlier, you don't see a lot of savings. On the Medicare side, there's a proposal to consolidate vaccine coverage under Medicare Part B that costs roughly $4 billion. There's an increase in physician payments that's proposed in a single year within the quality payment program for 3.5 billion. And then finally, something that's not discussed but is assumed in the budget is further extension and smoothing of the mandatory BCA Medicare sequester in the back half of the window. And so that's just simply an across the board cut that's extended in the out years. One of the only kind of Medicare reductions that's proposed that's significant. And again, as I mentioned before, I think kind of what's not in the budget that I find significant is sort of any real discussion about the Build Back Better Act, what's in terms of the prescription drug proposals, the coverage expansions. Obviously there are renewed talks on the Hill, particularly with Senator Manchin over a slimmed down package. And, the budget really kind of sidesteps that debate and defers to Congress to figure out what would be in that bill, as opposed to signaling where the administration would be. It's a very hands-off approach, probably the right political tactic, but as a policy matter, it's not clear where the administration stands, and it's not extremely transparent, in terms of or honest in terms of the way they're budgeting. In addition, again, I mentioned sort of the COVID supplemental dollars. You're going to see a COVID sup likely pass this week to the tune of 10 billion, which isn't included, and you can see additional supplementals requested. Those aren't reflected in the budget in any way, and it's unclear how those requests relate to, again, the base discretionary appropriations that are requested for public health agencies, as well as this new pot of money for future pandemic preparedness. And then lastly, again, I think the budget has some language signaling support for continuing flexibilities at the end of the PHE, like for example, telehealth within Medicare, but it doesn't account for those anywhere or specify the costs or savings that would result for them. And so I think it's really just a to be continued. And so with that, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, Jim, and let others opine on what they found interesting.
Great. Thanks, Greg. Don, what's in the budget and what's not in it?
Well, I think one thing that sort of connects back to what I said was, some of these mental health proposals increase Medicare Part A spending. And there's no suggested Medicare Part A offset. So the budget actually proposes to make the Medicare Part A trust fund even worse off. And as Greg was pointing out, there's a lot of new mandatory spending proposals in there with not very much on the mandatory offset size. And Congress is working on, and who knows if they'll actually reach agreement, but they're starting the beginning stages of maybe legislation around mental health that could include new mandatory spending. I don't think Republicans are going to go for tax increases to pay for that legislation. I think they would probably look for other mandatory offsets if a deal is reached. So, it's interesting that the budget doesn't offer sort of any help really in that regard.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, Don. Joe, and your perspective.
Yeah, I agree with both Greg and Don's assessment. I think a couple of the policies embedded that are worth noting, for instance, like if you look at that vaccine proposal, a new $2 billion a year plus vaccine program for uninsured Americans, and then covering vaccines under Medicare Part B. What's interesting about that is we basically have socialized vaccine purchasing and development in this country during the COVID pandemic, as far as it relates to coronavirus vaccines. They've asked for a whole bunch more money, as Don and Greg mentioned, for pandemic response. And one of the big hangups is, where has the money gone? It's unclear. Now, OMB is supposed to know. So there's either two things happening in that information has not been communicated to the Hill. Either OMB is holding that information for some reason, or one of the agencies, NIH, BARDA, FDA, CDC, are holding that information from OMB, or they don't know. So rather than have an administration say, WOA, maybe we need to get back to regular order and push more of these vaccines into the private distribution channel and get purchasing back to normal and development back to normal, they're doubling down on it. And what I think is going to happen if and when this supplemental gets passed is that the administration is going to pop up and they're going to say that, one, they didn't have a fair accounting, sorry about that. Or two, a bunch of vaccines were spoiled, and maybe tests as well, that they went past the use by date. So I think that, the fact that we've just socialized coronavirus vaccines in this country over the last few years, development and distribution, the administration can't admit where the money went, and now they're doubling down on it, could blow up in their faces down the road. The other thing on the substance abuse and mental health proposals is, as Greg mentioned, they just basically wiped out the term abuse in the agency that handles this issue. This is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And if you read the narrative, they just changed the name to Substance Use Mental Health Services Administration. This is an ideological tack that the administration's taking to say something.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm sorry, is there a question there? Oh, sorry. I thought somebody was chiming in.
Yeah, sorry, Joe. If I could ask the audience to please mute themselves to, stop the background noise, that would be great. Thank you. Sorry about that, Joe. Well,
there's a larger debate in this country that's not new about harm reduction versus primary prevention in addiction and overdose context. But look, we've got over 100,000 Americans dying just of opioids overdoses in this country. We've got massive amounts of people, tens of thousands dying from alcohol overdose, and we've got an increase in illegal drug use. And the administration is, tacitly approving the legalization of marijuana and if you're a primary prevention person, this budget kind of freaks you out because they've just written out the term abuse in the context of illegal drug use. If you're a harm reduction person and you're in that business, you're feeling good about it because you're going to have an open door to provide options to this administration to pursue that approach on drug abuse issues. And Greg is right. I think the Congress is going to do something in the mental health space and do more in the drug use space because it's really a crisis and there's bipartisan consensus that something needs to get done. There will probably be some type of big expenditure, I would think. If they can't get it done this year, I would think in the next Congress, another proposal will happen. But I do believe it's a Democratic priority to drive this to conclusion.
Thanks, Joe. And then a little bit more on the background on the budget itself. Can you tell us how the budget's prepared?
Well, it starts in the agencies, in the spring. So once they get done with this budget and they defend it on the Hill, they can relax for a little bit at OMB and the agencies, but then within a few months, and by a few months, I mean, 2 or 3, not 6, the agencies will begin to formulate next year's budget. They'll get some communication from OMB, usually begins oral communication about where the appetite might be for increased spending or new programs. There'll be discussions between the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, and some of the agencies and departments as they're working through policy proposals. And then the agencies will start to put the numbers next to those policies, and they'll be working on that. And then there'll be submissions and discussion in September. That's when a final agency proposal is generally sent to OMB. There's more debate all the way into December, and then it's supposed to get out the first week in February. As I said, it functions, its primary I shouldn't say its primary purpose, a key purpose of it is to discipline the agencies throughout the year. So for instance, if the Secretary of the Interior pops up and has to give testimony on the Hill, that testimony is approved by Office of Management and Budget. And one of the key things that they'll look for are all the policies outlined in that testimony, were they in the budget? Have they been discussed? Does everybody know? That way you don't have a cabinet secretary pop up with a new proposal mid-year, like he wants to develop part of Yellowstone to raise money and increase tourism, or do something else that wasn't maybe vetted at the Domestic Policy Council and the National Economic Council, and maybe even brought to the president. So it's a disciplinary function throughout the year so that there's no more policy proposals. Now, does it happen? Yeah, of course. You have emergencies, you have exigent circumstances, and you have secretaries who feel really strongly about a particular policy, and they'll want to go to the president and say, we want to deviate from the budget in order to do X, Y, or Z. But that's not generally easy to get a straight shot, and OMB can make that very difficult, including, the White House Chief of Staff can make it difficult to allow that secretary to get an opportunity and get time with the president to appeal for a new policy. The gating item is usually the president's budget when you're talking about a policy proposal, and it's wait until next year and the budget development process, and we'll consider it then, but don't bring us new policies throughout the year.
Great. Thanks, Joe. And then Greg, can you tell us a little bit more about OMB's role in the budget and regulatory process? And more specifically, what is the PAD and the Health Division?
Great. Thanks, Jim. Let me start off there with describing what a PAD is. So OMB, Office of Management and Budget, on the budget side is broken down into 4 or 5 resource management offices. And the Health Division, so these are basically issue areas that are different divisions. So the Health Division is the largest of which, and Don and Joe and myself each were responsible for running that Health Division at one point in time. So the PAD is the political appointee who is responsible for running that division. So in the healthcare division, we had 5 branches: Medicare, Medicaid, public health, HHS, and then the health insurance division. And so we were responsible for working with the nearly 50 career staff below us to basically develop the budget, negotiate it with HHS, and then obviously communicate not just the budget but the president's priorities to the department and its operating divisions and agencies, as well as to the Hill. And so you're the lead negotiator with Capitol Hill on appropriations. You're also responsible for budget execution. So once the appropriations come, you have the apportionment authority that basically doles out funds to the department to make sure that the department's spending those appropriations efficiently and effectively and aren't burning up through the resources too quickly. In addition, because OMB has this role of kind of the enforcer of the president's policies and priorities and communicator, it really is the funnel through which everything flows. Like Joe mentioned, every statement of administration policy, every executive order, every Hill testimony, everything flows through OMB for review and for clearance. And by virtue of that, every single significant guidance document or significant piece of regulation that's being considered not just gets reviewed by OMB OIRA, which is the regulatory arm of OMB, but also the health pad and the health division. They'll review those proposed regulations and guidances to make sure they're consistent with administration policy and that they're consistent with the law and so forth. So OMB really has its hand in everything. I think the funnel analogy is a pretty good one. And in particular, the pad, you're the backstop of that. You're the political appointee to make all those calls on behalf of the president and the OMB director. I think a former CMS administrator once said, OMB is the super god of our society. And I think there's some truth to that because they have their hand in just about every piece of government because they control, administration policy as well as the flow of dollars.
Great. Thanks.
Can I just chime in on that real quick?
Of course.
Just a little bit of trivia on the apportionment authority. Congress just restricted OMB's authority on the apportionment. They had proposed to eliminate the ability for OMB to stop the flow of funds when the Biden administration came in. That was an effort coming out of the hold on funds that occurred during the Trump administration around Ukraine. But in the Consolidated Appropriations Act 2022, which just passed, they put in a 10-day notification provision. So if OMB holds funds for a reason outside of the normal course, they've got 10 days to notify Congress that they have done this. It remains to be seen to me how this is going to play out and actually be as effective as the Hill thinks it will be in keeping the money going. I do think it does create management challenges for an executive branch in ways that maybe are not appreciated. There were all sorts of apportionments that occurred throughout any given year for any number of reasons, whether you think that a program, for instance, that's funded at NIH, is the dollars are not being spent appropriately. You get allegations of fraud or something like that, and OMB could apportion money, or some dispute about how a program is unfolding. And now Congress has restricted OMB's ability to do that. It's early in the process of that. We'll see how it folds out, but that's just a little bit about the apportionment authority.
Thanks, Joe.
And if there's, I was going to mention one other thing that actually doesn't get a lot of attention that sometimes pops up when you're working at OMB is that agencies will spend money that they're not supposed to. And it's a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is actually a criminal statute, though no one's ever prosecuted for it. But you'd get a call from HHS saying, "Oh, we discovered that so and so spent some money, some agency, and they weren't supposed to." And typically they'll find some longtime bureaucrat who's probably about to retire who will take the blame and then be subsequently retired. But those would be very uncomfortable calls that the agency would have to do because they're violating the law on that, and that would pop up every once in a while too.
Thanks, Don. And Don, let's stick with you. Joe mentioned earlier that there's a target date for release of the federal budget that I think is the first Monday in February. But this year, the budget came out about 6 weeks late. Any thoughts on why that delay might have been?
Yeah, I mean, this particular budget was very late. Sometimes they're late, but this one was pretty late for being, a budget in a normal cycle, not the first budget administration releases right after they've gotten elected. I think there's probably a number of reasons. The COVID wave the country was experiencing over the winter may have delayed it. They may have been debating how much money to ask in that regard. The Ukraine crisis actually started back in November, December. They may have been wondering, like, how is that going to play out? Were they going to have to ask for more defense spending? I think another big reason actually was I think they were waiting for the omnibus to pass because, as I mentioned, they want to put the actual numbers of actual spending in the budget to build off next, to show like this is how much of an increase we're going to have in these particular programs that we're proposing. And the omnibus wasn't passing, and I don't think they could wait forever. But I think that was part of it. And then finally, something I think a lot of people overlook, and it's not just true for OMB, I think it's something that can impact many federal agencies, was that the director and the deputy director were both acting, right? They only recently, in the last few months, were confirmed. And having a Senate confirmed, person running the agency is just more effective than having someone who hasn't yet been Senate confirmed and is in an acting position.
Great, thanks, Don. And Joe, one of the key points highlighted in the budget is the fact that it reduces the deficit by $1.3 trillion over 10 years, which would be the largest reduction in spending on a year-to-year basis in U.S. history. Where's that reduction in spending coming from, and does it show a major change on the part of this administration?
Well, it doesn't show a major change. It's just money that was spent in the COVID emergency that isn't going to be spent this year. It'd be like, me going out at Christmas time and going to Loro Piana or something and buying a $10,000 overcoat for myself for Christmas and then saying, suddenly in 2022, I'm saving $10,000. I mean, they spent the money last year. The fact that they're not going to spend the money this year in the COVID emergency doesn't mean they saved the money. It's a gimmick. And Don's exactly right. There are a number of really concerning data points in this budget that are unaddressed, including the fact that the Medicare Part A trust fund is going to start to go bankrupt in 2026. More dollars going out than coming in. And that's like tomorrow, because we've got midterm elections. It's not going to get addressed this year. Then you're going to have a presidential election. It's not going to get addressed. The next president, or in President Biden's second term, is going to be immediately confronted with a crisis in Medicare. If past is prologue, they'll do the old DC move of raising taxes and cutting benefits, but it could get extremely painful and extremely messy in that process if this isn't addressed. So no, there's nothing noteworthy or laudatory about the fact that they're not spending that $1 trillion on COVID money this year.
Thanks, Joe. And Greg, you're an expert on the budget reconciliation process. Can you tell us what that is and why it's important?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. Everyone's heard a lot about Build Back Better and budget reconciliation and how talks could resume, as we've discussed. It's important to understand the process that they would be utilizing, and it's called budget reconciliation. And the name comes from, basically the fact that it is a process, it's a fast-track process in the Senate that's designed to facilitate changes in mandatory spending programs and in revenues to reflect basically assumptions that are in the congressional budget resolution. So as Don mentioned, the budget gets transmitted by the president. That kicks off this process in Congress whereby they write a budget resolution that is passed in Congress. And once it's passed, it doesn't get signed into law, it's a resolution. But if in that resolution they provide what are called reconciliation instructions or directives to committees, to save or to spend a certain amount of money, their numerical targets, they're able to avail themselves of this fast track procedure in the Senate that essentially allows for budget related legislation to not be filibustered. So it's an ability to pass fiscal legislation on a simple majority. So I think it's very unique, it's very powerful. The current instructions that the Democrats are attempting to use for Build Back Better were provided pursuant to the fiscal year 2022 budget resolution. So the reason that there's a bit of a race against time is if those instructions aren't used by September 30th at midnight, that privileged vehicle goes away. And basically Congress would have to pass a new budget resolution for fiscal year 23, including new reconciliation instructions to be able to have this fast track vehicle that, again, would allow them to avail themselves of this process for a simple majority in order to move their agenda forward. And one thing I want to mention before we move on is the reason reconciliation is so controversial, again, is you're limiting the rights of the minority in the Senate to debate. And in particular, because of that, there are strict controls on what can be placed in the bill. The biggest of which is the so-called Berg rule in the Senate. There are 6 tests, but essentially it's a determination of whether or not a provision is considered primarily budgetary in nature. Because again, the legislation can only be fiscal in nature, and so it can't be too much in the way of policy.
Thanks,
You know,
Greg.
and to
Go
follow
ahead,
up a
Joe.
little bit on what Greg said, I thought more sort of forward looking, thinking about where all this might lead us. When the Democrat Congress did, the reconciliation bill, the COVID relief legislation, American Rescue Plan, they effectively took a lot of spending that would have been discretionary spending and made it mandatory spending, and thus available under the reconciliation bill. I mean, it was a reconciliation bill like none we've ever seen before. And I'm not sure how much they thought about the long-term sort of implications of this and what it might mean for a budget, a president's budget or the budget resolution. I mean, if we went back in time to 2017, Trump was elected, Republicans controlled Congress. In the Senate, they didn't have much of a majority. And there was clearly a desire to increase defense spending, but the cost of increasing defense spending was increasing non-defense discretionary spending to have a deal with the Democrats to get 60 votes in the Senate. That doesn't have to happen anymore in the future. If Republicans control the Senate and the House, even if they have a small majority in the Senate, they could do a reconciliation bill. They could make defense spending mandatory for a couple of years. And they could leave non-defense discretionary spending at a much lower level. So I don't think people have really contemplated about how the current sort of use of reconciliation is, what it might mean for 3 years from now, 5 years from now, type implications.
The other thing about it is too, I mean, it was originally conceived as a deficit and debt cutting mechanism, and it has served the opposite in recent memory.
That's right. And, if you look historically, there had been some bipartisan reconciliation bills, but, I wanted to point out the last of which was 1997. So since that time, it's become this highly partisan vehicle to push, one party's policy agenda. And over time, it's sort of contorted this process that was meant, as Joe mentioned, toward achieving budgetary savings, and twisted into something else.
And reconciliation, very important for healthcare because Medicare and Medicaid are entitlement programs and often can only pass under the reconciliation umbrella because they're very controversial and any senator can filibuster and hold it up. So that's why reconciliation is super important if you're in the healthcare space. So thank you. And then, Don, the president's budget proposal includes a very positive outlook for the economy. For example, the budget request assumes an inflation rate of 4.7% this year, but only 2.3% for the rest of the decade. In your opinion, is that realistic?
No, I don't think it's going to be realistic. And I think, it's interesting that it used to be much more common. If you went back to the 80s and 90s and even through, I think, up to the election of Obama, that there was always a lot of criticism from the opposing party, typically, of the economic assumptions that were included in the budget, and that sort of fell away. It hasn't been as much of an issue in the last, say, 10 years or so. But I think that's probably going to come back. I mean, clearly when they were crafting the economic assumptions in this budget, which would have been many, 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 many months ago, back in the fall at the sort of the latest, their expectations of inflation were way, way, way off. I mean, the inflation rate this year is undoubtedly going to be higher than 4.7%. I think we'd be very lucky if ultimately that's where it ends up for the year. And, depending upon what the Fed has to do to try to constrain inflation and how long it lasts and, where things are headed, could there be a possibility of a recession? No budget ever includes a year of down economic growth, but that would have a potentially profound impact on tax revenue, spending potentially going up. And then the interest rates assumptions and actual interest rates, that can have a big impact. I mean, can we imagine what financing the debt's going to be if treasury bonds and bills, et cetera, go up 300-400 basis points in costs? I mean, it's almost inconceivable what the impact is going to be. It's going to be hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars potentially every year in spending that's just going to finance the debt. And so the assumptions and then followed by what actually happens can have a big impact on not only the current budget, but the future budget.
Yeah, I want to chime in on that. I mean, we're currently at 7.9% on the inflation rate, and they're saying, it's gonna moderate considerably and then get low again. I don't know anybody who sees that really happening, and why you would bet on it right now is somewhat elusive. The other thing they do, and they mentioned this last year in the budget, which is interesting, is they're trying to change the frame of reference for how to view the national debt. So, it's frequently viewed as a percentage of gross domestic product. We're right now at about 129. They say it's going to decline to 121 shortly, but they want us to view it as in the context of how much it costs to pay for it, how much the interest payments are. And they're saying, it's really very cheap. It's got a functional interest rate of less than 1% historically over the last 10 years. To Don's point, we could get in some real trouble if the borrowing costs start to leap here. You're going to see the cost of living adjustments for those government assistance programs really leap due to that 7.9%. You're going to see cost of inflation ripple through. Now, we're not seeing it yet in healthcare, but that's in large part due to the function of long-term contracts. And when you're going to see some of these healthcare programs have not existed in a high interest rate environment. Part D, for instance, the Affordable Care Act was created in a low interest rate environment. There have been new programs brought online. We could start to have some really scary, never before seen effects if we get sustained high inflation over a period of time. And right now, I'm certainly not betting that we're going down to 2.5% interest rates anytime soon.
Thanks. So for each of you, turning to healthcare, the administration is a year in now, and this is its second budget. So were there any major differences between the priorities this year and last year that surprised you or struck you as being particularly significant? Let's start with you, Joe.
Well, we've referenced the fact that Build Back Better isn't in there. I think when you look at, say, the drug pricing proposal that got all the applause line in the State of the Union and gave a lot of pharmaceutical industry lobbyists palpitations, and the biotech index took a hit following that. There's not much in the budget on that. And you look at the insulin flat copay proposal, which is just passed the House. That was part of the drug pricing proposal in Build Back Better. So parts of it are starting to get pulled out and passed, which makes it's less likely that the whole thing is going to get passed. I think that the big drug pricing proposal, it's really kind of in life support. It's not a zero, but they've got to get something done on drug pricing. I'm with Greg on it's glaring that there's no, little reference to there's nothing about Build Back Better, no reference, no expansive section on the Affordable Care Act. The green agenda, the energy agenda has about 6 times as much space as drug abuse and the overdose crisis in this country. That could have been more expansive about how they're gonna tackle it. But I think overall, it just lacked a lot of ambition. And we're not even, I'll just do a little bit of a tangent for a second. I mean, the defense piece, Don alluded to this, that was all built before Russia invaded Ukraine. And now you've got bipartisan support for ramping up defense budgets. There's going to be pressure to cut back on some of the domestic spending agenda in that context. So I think you're in for an interesting rest of the year, but I think we've seen the high watermark of the Biden administration's ambitions in healthcare, at least for the time being.
Thanks, Joe. Let's go to you, Don. Any observations about differences between last year and this year?
Well, I think maybe not necessarily a difference, but a continuation of just the substantial proposals to increase discretionary spending, non-defense discretionary spending. I mean, Joe alluded to some of these proposals. They've got the new ARPA-H proposal, NIH spending proposing to go way, way, way up. And at first I was like, this is sort of interesting. And then the more I sort of thought about it, I almost wonder if the Democrats are going to try very, very, very hard to get, another omnibus passed for fiscal year 23 before the next Congress gets sworn in, because, they're going to assume, I think very likely, the Republicans will control the House, maybe even the Senate. And if they can get another bill with even higher spending enacted, then if there's just continuing resolutions, it's at a much higher spending level than even the fiscal year 22 spending. And if Republicans just basically say we're only going to do CRs until 2025 and see who the next president is, if the president gets reelected or what happens, that will be at an even higher level if they can get something done this year. And so I do think that these substantial increases in discretionary spending they're proposing is serving sort of a twofold purpose of trying to get spending up as much as they can before they lose the ability to control spending.
Thanks, Don. And Greg, your thoughts?
I just want to echo what I'd said earlier, as well as what Joe was saying. I think, what struck me was, last year during the transition year, the budget had sort of scant details on drug pricing. It signaled some support for negotiation. It also signaled some support for lowering the Medicare age, other coverage expansion provisions, but didn't reflect kind of anything in the numbers, because I think the administration wasn't ready to set policy. What struck me as unique and interesting is the regression this year, right? There are even fewer details. So again, nothing's assumed in the numbers, but they don't even mention any of these proposals by name specifically. So I think that's just not common. Usually over time, an administration kind of builds out its policy agenda, particularly on the legislative side, and especially with respect to the mandatory proposals in the Medicare and Medicaid space, especially ones that would, influence tens of billions of dollars one way or the other. Separately, I think one other thing that jumped out at me was the lack of details on the regulatory agenda. So we didn't really talk too much about this, but in the budget, there's often a table that's posted that shows sort of the regulations that are assumed in the baseline that reflects, the regulatory agenda the administration plans to pursue. So obviously during the transition, budget, you didn't see anything there. They didn't really have an agenda. Now they've started to build out a regulatory agenda and move forward on certain regulations. You'd expect to see a little bit more detail, but it just sort of told me that the administration is kind of keeping its powder dry, particularly in the space with respect to drug pricing, because they want to see what Congress does. The only proposal that I thought was it was interesting that was reflected and assumed in the baseline was the pharmacy DIR proposal that they assumed the $40 billion net cost to the federal government in the baseline that was in a recent proposed rule. So that signals to me that they intend to finalize that. Aside from that and the rebate rule, there wasn't really any new ground that was broken on the regulatory side, but that's something I'll be looking out for next year post midterms, particularly if the House flips. The administration will probably propose more in the way of administrative actions in their budget submission.
Yeah, to Greg's point on that, just to hit this nuance here, because those two regs are in there, Congress, if it proposes to postpone them or kill them, they can use the savings in, say, a reconciliation bill or in a pay for to get something appropriated. So the fact that anti-kickback is still in the baseline, now there's a postponement of that to pay for the insulin bill, but that's why, because it's still in the baseline. So once it's in the baseline, then you can use it if you eliminate it based upon the vagaries of CBO scoring.
Well, thank you all. We're approaching the end of our time, but before we leave, I would like to ask each of you to leave our audience with one final thought. Is what's the key thing they should remember from today's meeting? So let's start with you, Greg.
I think that's easy. I think just remember that OMB is the super god of our society. So we control everything, and and the health pad in particular controls the HGS budget. And so it was great to be on a panel with Joe and Don. Two former health pads. We've got three of us. It's a small group, and hope you guys learned something new about how OMB works and the federal budget. And happy to take questions offline.
Thanks, Greg. And how about you, Don?
Yeah, I think looking ahead, if say Republicans do take the Congress and Biden's budget next year, looking into the budget to see if there's proposals, that they're trying to reach a bipartisan deal. Like, Clinton proposed a lot of Medicare savings in the fiscal year 97 and fiscal year 98 budgets to signify, like, yes, I'm ready to cut a deal and extend the life of the Part A trust fund. And that's what led to the BBA of 97. You can get a sense of where Congress and the president may be headed if the president is putting something out there that the other party might agree to.
Thanks, Don. And Joe, the final thought.
Final thought is OMB pad was the best job I ever had, and I'll be interested to see if Congress actually gives the administration anything close to the NIH money. NIH normally gets what it wants. It's got a very big lobby on its behalf, but there's a lot of frustration with them. So I'll be interested to see what the final number is this year.
Well, thank you all. On behalf of our audience, I would like to thank our three former super gods, and also invite our audience to look out for our invitation to our next Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum on April 19th, where we will host a panel of reporters from inside CMS, inside health policy, and modern healthcare. So please stay tuned. And if you want to contact any of our speakers offline, if you shoot me a note, I'll put you in touch. And thank you all for joining today. I look forward to seeing you at our next Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. Thank you.